I tried to shake off the strange feeling that had settled over me, but the truth was, I couldn't. Something wasn't right. My boyfriend was still late. Maybe he'd gotten stuck in traffic. Maybe he'd just forgotten about our plans. But as I stood up, determined to go for a walk and clear my head, I heard the doorbell ring. I rushed to open it, expecting to see him standing there, apologizing for being late. But when I opened the door, no one was there. I stepped outside into the cold, feeling a mix of confusion and dread. My footsteps echoed on the snow-covered path, but something felt off. Then I saw it. A shadow. It moved across the yard in the distance, quick and fleeting, disappearing behind the tree line. My breath hitched, my heart pounding in my chest. Who, or what was out there? The room felt colder now, despite the heater running. I walked over to the window and pulled back the curtain, scanning the yard for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. Everything was still. Too still. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I sat down, I saw an envelope on my table. Against my better judgment, I picked it up. I unfolded it and read through the words, looking for any sign of who could have sent it. But there was nothing. No clues. Just more strange, unsettling lines. It's time you remember who you are. Who I was. I didn't understand. What did that mean? I couldn't shake the thought of it, but when I read the next part, my blood went cold. I remember the old house at the end of the street. You were only 5 when you left it behind. Your mother said it was time to move on, but I know the truth. You'll remember soon enough. I couldn't breathe. The house. I hadn't thought about it in years. It was the house we had lived in before we moved when I was just a little girl. The memories were faint, blurry even, but now they were rushing back to me. I hadn't remembered that house in so long. Why now? Why on Valentine's Day? I felt a sudden rush of fear, and I glanced over my shoulder, convinced someone was standing just behind me. But when I turned, there was no one there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. As the night dragged on, things began to get stranger. The lights flickered, not just once, but repeatedly, like they were trying to tell me something. I would walk into the kitchen, and the lights would go out. I would flick them back on, only for them to flicker again, as though they were trying to communicate. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and twist, moving in ways that felt unnatural. I'd hear whispers, faint at first, barely audible, but they grew louder, clearer, as if they were calling my name. "Come to me," they whispered. "It's time to remember." I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A loud thud, coming from the bedroom. I stood frozen in place, my heart hammering in my chest. Slowly, I approached the bedroom, the fear in my gut growing heavier with each step. And then, as I reached the door, I saw a figure, standing in the window, just behind the glass, almost hidden by the curtains. I couldn't see its face, but I knew someone, or something, was there. I turned quickly, but when I glanced back to the window, the figure was gone. There was nothing there, except for the letter, still lying on the table. Valentine's Day is supposed to be about connection, about the magic of finding someone who truly understands you. That's what I thought when I agreed to go on a date with a man I met online. His name was Daniel, or at least, that's what he told me. We had been talking for weeks, and everything about him seemed perfect, almost too perfect. He had this effortless charm, the kind of voice that made you want to keep listening, and a way with words that made him feel familiar even though I had never met him in person. Our fascination with the unexplained, and even our childhood stories that, oddly enough, had eerie similarities. It felt right. But looking back now, there were things I should have noticed. Strange little details that didn't add up. The way he never spoke much about his family. How he would respond with vague answers when I asked about his job. The way his messages always came at odd hours, like he never truly existed in the same time zone as me. But I ignored all of it, convincing myself I was just overthinking. That night, I arrived at the restaurant early. The place was warm and dimly lit, the kind of cozy ambience that made everything feel intimate, almost safe. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the slight nervousness bubbling in my stomach. First dates were always nerve-wracking, but this one felt different, special. And then, he arrived. Daniel walked in, dressed in a sleek black coat, his dark hair perfectly styled, and those piercing eyes that seemed to notice everything. He smiled at me, and for a moment, all my worries faded. He was real, and he was just as captivating in person. But as we settled into our conversation, something felt off. He was polite, charming, engaging, but distant. His eyes would dart around the room every few minutes, scanning the crowd, checking his watch as if he was on a tight schedule. At first, I thought maybe he was nervous too, but the more I watched him, the more uneasy I felt. Then, there was the way he avoided certain questions. "So, where did you say you grew up again?" I asked, stirring my drink, trying to keep things casual. He hesitated for just a second, just long enough for me to notice. Then, he smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "A small town. You wouldn't know it." That was the first crack in his perfect image. The second came when he mentioned an old childhood story, one that, strangely enough, sounded exactly like mine, word for word. A shiver ran down my spine, but I laughed it off, telling myself it was just a weird coincidence. And yet, the unease was settling deeper now, like a quiet whisper in the back of my mind telling me something wasn't right. Then, in the middle of our meal, he glanced at his watch again. And this time, his entire demeanor shifted. One second, he was sitting across from me, engaged in conversation. The next, he was standing up, his coat already in his hands. "I'll be right back," he said smoothly, his tone light, but his expression unreadable. "I just need to step outside for a second." I nodded, confused but not yet alarmed. "Everything okay?" He smiled. "Yeah, just a quick call. Won't take long." And then, he walked out the door. I waited. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was a work call. Maybe something urgent had come up. I sipped my drink, scrolling absent-mindedly through my phone. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. I started watching the entrance, expecting him to walk back in any second. The waiter came by to refill my glass, and I asked if he had seen the man who was with me step outside. The waiter frowned. "I don't think so. I haven't seen anyone leave through the front door." I felt my stomach twist. "Are you sure?" He nodded. "Positive. I would have noticed." A cold unease settled in my chest. I grabbed my coat and stepped outside, looking up and down the street. He was gone. Not a trace of him anywhere. No calls. No texts. Nothing. I went back inside, trying to reason with myself. Maybe something had come up. Maybe he had an emergency and had to leave in a hurry. But why wouldn't he text me? Why wouldn't he at least let me know? An hour passed. Then another. And that's when the fear really began to creep in. It wasn't just that he had left. It was that no one else in the restaurant had even noticed him. When I asked the hostess about my date, she gave me a confused look and said, "You came in alone?" I laughed, thinking she was joking, but her expression didn't change. I showed her the messages on my phone, proof that I hadn't imagined it. But when I scrolled back through the chat, something was wrong. The messages, every single one of them, were gone. Like he had never existed at all. I didn't sleep that night. I spent hours searching for him online, trying to find any trace of him. But his profile was gone. His phone number was no longer in my call history. Every trace of our conversations had vanished. Panic set in. I searched his name, tried looking up any record of him. Nothing. No social media, no LinkedIn, no public records. It was as if I had gone on a date with a ghost. Then, a thought crossed my mind, one that made my breath hitch. I pulled up an old article from years ago, one I had stumbled across months before when I first started talking to him. It was about a missing person, a man who had disappeared on Valentine's Day 10 years ago. And when I clicked on the image attached to the article, my blood ran cold. It was him. The same dark hair, the same piercing eyes, the same knowing smile. But the date on the article? It was dated a decade ago. My fingers trembled as I reread the details. The man in the article had gone missing on the night of February 14th, after leaving a restaurant in the middle of a date. His body was never found. I slammed my laptop shut, my pulse pounding in my ears. And just when I thought it was over, My phone buzzed. A single message from an unknown number. "I'll be watching you." Valentine's Day always carried a strange weight in my family. It was never spoken about, but there was an unspoken rule. No one ever celebrated it. No flowers, no chocolates, no dinners, nothing. I never questioned it growing up. It was just the way things were. But that year, I was home alone on February 14th, and for the first time, I realized just how deeply embedded that silence truly was. My parents had left for the weekend, a rare getaway they had planned months in advance. I wasn't supposed to be alone. My cousin was meant to stay over, but she canceled at the last minute. So, there I was, in the old house I had grown up in, sitting in the dimly lit living room with the soft hum of the television filling the space around me. It had been years since I had spent the night there by myself. The house had always felt different when I was alone. The air is heavier, the shadows longer. That night, it felt worse. I kept getting this gnawing sensation that I was being watched. Not just the usual paranoia that comes with being alone in a big house, but something deeper, something real. Every so often, I would feel a chill brush past me, like a draft creeping under the doors, except there were no open windows. And then, the whispers started. At first, I thought it was the wind, a soft, distant murmur that seemed to come from upstairs. But the more I tried to ignore it, the clearer it became. It wasn't just noise. It was voices. Every night, for as long as I could remember, I had heard strange sounds coming from the attic. My parents always dismissed it as the house settling, old wood groaning under time's weight. But that night, the whispers were louder. They didn't blend into the house. They felt separate. They felt directed at me. I don't know what possessed me to go upstairs. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something else. Something I couldn't name. The attic door was at the end of the hallway, barely used, always locked. Except that night, it wasn't. It was open. The air inside was suffocating, thick with the scent of dust and something older, something like roses long since dried and forgotten. I hesitated at the threshold, my heart pounding, every instinct telling me to turn back. But something was pulling me in. I stepped inside. The attic was cluttered with old furniture, yellowed newspapers, and broken picture frames. But in the farthest corner, beneath a tattered lace cloth, sat a wooden chest. Something inside me already knew. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid, my breath catching in my throat as I uncovered what lay within. A diary. The leather was worn, the pages delicate with age. The name etched on the front made my blood run cold. It was my grandmother's name. I had never met her. She had died long before I was born, but her presence had always lingered in the house. My parents rarely spoke about her. The few times they did, their voices carried an odd mix of reverence and sorrow. I opened the diary. At first, it was just letters, pages and pages of love letters. Beautiful, poetic, filled with longing. They were addressed to someone named Elias. But then, the letters changed. The handwriting grew erratic. The words are less like love and more like obsession. And then, buried between the pages, I found a newspaper clipping. A name, a date, a death. Elias had died on Valentine's Day. Murdered. The diary's final entry was written the night before he died. I cannot let him go. If I cannot have him in life, then I will have him in death. Forever. My hands shook as I turned the page. The ink was smeared, as if the words had been written in a frenzy. He's here. He came back. I can hear him whispering. He says he forgives me. He says we will be together soon. I slammed the diary shut, my pulse pounding in my ears. The whispers in the attic grew louder, wrapping around me like invisible hands. And then, I heard my name, spoken softly, right behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The attic door slammed shut. The whispers turned into a single voice, deep and sorrowful. It didn't sound angry. It sounded longing. You found me. The temperature in the room dropped. My breath came out in white puffs. The diary in my hands grew unbearably cold, and then, just as suddenly as it started, the room fell silent. But the air shifted. The attic felt fuller. I backed away, my hands gripping the diary like a lifeline. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead, and then the lights flickered. A shadow moved in the corner, slow and deliberate. "She wouldn't let me go," said the voice right next to my ear. I stumbled back, my heart racing, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was hearing. "But now, you've set me free." The attic door creaked open on its own. The air lightened. The whispers faded. I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for breath in the freezing night air. When my parents returned the next day, I didn't tell them what happened, but I noticed something had changed. The house felt lighter. The attic door, which had always been locked, was gone, as if it had never been there at all. And the diary? It vanished. What do you think? Have you ever experienced something that made you question everything you thought you knew? Have you ever felt like you weren't alone, even in an empty room? If so, I want to hear about it. Share your own stories in the comments. I will read them all. If these stories sent chills down your spine, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more horror stories. And remember, whether you believe in ghosts or not, whether you think these were just coincidences or something much more, always be cautious, because some things never let go. I'll see you in the next video.